Imagine stepping onto a shore you left 3 years ago, expecting to be greeted by the joyful shouts of 117 people, your friends, your family, your own daughter and granddaughter. Instead, you are greeted by silence. A silence so profound, it feels heavy. The wind rustles through the trees, the waves lap against the sand, but of human life, there is not a whisper. This is not a ghost story in the traditional sense. There are no haunted houses or specters rattling chains. This is something far more unsettling because it is real. In 1590, an entire English settlement on the coast of North Carolina vanished from the face of the earth. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no bodies, just an abandoned village, a ruined fort, and a single cryptic word carved into a wooden post: Croatoan. What happened on Roanoke Island is the foundational mystery of America. Before Jamestown, before Plymouth Rock, there was Roanoke, the colony that was swallowed by the New World. This is their story. To understand the end, we must begin at the beginning. The year is 1587. England under Queen Elizabeth I is a rising power, hungry to challenge the dominance of Spain. Spain controls vast territories in the Americas, flowing with gold and silver. England wants its share. Sir Walter Raleigh, a dashing favorite of the Queen, dreams of establishing an English foothold in North America. He calls this vast, uncharted land Virginia, in honor of the Virgin Queen. Raleigh had tried before. In 1585, he sent a military expedition to Roanoke Island, a small, sandy barrier island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. It was a disaster. The soldiers, led by aggressive men, treated the local Native American tribes with brutality. They relied on the natives for food, but burned their villages when things went missing. Starving and terrified of retaliation, the soldiers abandoned the island and hitched a ride back to England with Sir Francis Drake a year later. They left behind nothing but bad blood and a legacy of mistrust. Roanoke was already a cursed place. But Raleigh was undeterred. He needed a permanent settlement, not just a military outpost. For his next attempt in 1587, he changed the strategy completely. This time, he wouldn't send soldiers looking for gold. He would send families looking for a home. The 1587 expedition was different. The recruited settlers were farmers, carpenters, and tradesmen. Most importantly, this group included women and children. There were 117 people in total, including 17 women and 9 children. They were investors in a grand dream. They were promised 500 acres of land each. They were going to build a new life. To lead them, Raleigh chose John White. White was not a soldier, he was an artist. He had been on the previous expedition and had painted incredible watercolors of the local flora, fauna, and Native American tribes. He was a man who appreciated the beauty of the land, a gentle soul compared to the military commanders of the past. He was appointed governor of the new city of Raleigh. The plan was sound. They were supposed to sail to the Chesapeake Bay area, further north in modern-day Virginia, a place with deeper water for ships and better farmland. It was supposed to be a fresh start, far away from the bad memories of Roanoke Island. But the expedition was plagued by misfortune from the start. Their naval pilot, a Portuguese man named Simon Fernandez, was untrustworthy and more interested in piracy against Spanish ships than transporting settlers. In July 1587, after a long and grueling crossing of the Atlantic, they arrived off the coast of North Carolina. Fernandez anchored near Roanoke Island to make contact. While Governor White and a small group went ashore to check the old fort, Fernandez made a shocking decision. He ordered the sailors to dump all the settlers and their supplies on Roanoke Island. The summer is far spent, Fernandez claimed. He refused to take them further north to the Chesapeake. He wanted to go privateering before the season ended. John White protested, but he was powerless. The 117 settlers were stranded. They were dropped off at the exact spot where the previous English expedition had disastrously failed. They were surrounded by tribes who already hated and feared English people. The dream of Chesapeake Bay evaporated. They were back in the lion's den. The settlers tried to make the best of it. They repaired the rotting cottages left by the previous soldiers. They cleared brush around the fort, but the atmosphere was tense. Almost immediately, disaster struck. A colonist named George Howe was out crabbing alone when he was ambushed by Native Americans. He was shot with 16 arrows and his skull was crushed. The message was clear. The English were not welcome here. Fear spread through the camp like a disease. Governor White tried to negotiate peace. He reached out to the Croatoan tribe, a neighboring group living on Hatteras Island to the south. The Croatoans were cautious but had been friendly in the past. Monteo, a Croatoan Native American who had traveled to England and returned with White, acted as a mediator. He was a bridge between two worlds, and for his loyalty, he was baptized as the first Native American Protestant Christian. But even Monteo couldn't erase the past. The other local tribes, the Croatoans and the Roanokes, remembered the English burning their corn in villages years earlier. They would not parley. Amidst this fear and escalating violence, a miracle happened, a glimmer of hope. On August 18, 1587, Governor John White's daughter, Eleanor, gave birth to a baby girl. Eleanor was married to Ananias Dare, a bricklayer and one of the governor's assistants. They named Virginia Dare. She was the first English child born in the New World. Her birth was a powerful symbol. It meant they were not just visitors, they were planting roots. For John White, holding his tiny granddaughter in that wild, dangerous land, the stakes became incredibly personal. This island was no longer just a strategic outpost, it was the home of his flesh and blood. But a baby cannot survive on hope alone. By late August, it became clear that they had arrived too late in the season to plant crops. Their supplies were dwindling fast. The settlers were terrified of the approaching winter and the hostile tribes surrounding them. They needed help. They needed supplies, livestock, and more protection from England.
The colonists held a desperate meeting. They begged Governor White to return to England and plead their case to Sir Walter Raleigh. He was the only one with enough influence to ensure relief was sent quickly. White did not want to go. He felt he was abandoning his post. More painfully, he was abandoning his daughter Eleanor and his newborn granddaughter Virginia. But the settlers were insistent. "You must go for us," they argued, "or we will all perish." Reluctantly, with a heavy heart, John White agreed. He made sure the settlers were as secure as possible. Before he left, they established a protocol for emergency. "If you must leave this location," White instructed them, "carve the name of your destination on a tree or a post in a conspicuous place." He added one crucial detail. "If you are leaving in distress, if you are under attack, carve a cross mark above the name." On August 27, 1587, just 9 days after Virginia Dare was born, John White boarded a ship and sailed back toward England. He stood on the deck, watching the coastline of Roanoke Island fade into the mist. He believed he would be back in a few months, by the spring of 1588 at the latest. He had no idea that it would be the last time he would ever see them alive. John White sailed back to England with a desperate urgency. He carried with him a list of supplies the colony needed to survive the winter. In his mind, he would be back on Roanoke Island by spring, holding his granddaughter Virginia again. He arrived in England in November 1587, only to find a nation preparing for an apocalypse. The long simmering tension between Protestant England and Catholic Spain had exploded. King Philip II of Spain was assembling the Spanish Armada, the greatest fleet of warships the world had ever seen, to invade England and overthrow Queen Elizabeth I. Every ship, every cannon, and every able-bodied sailor in England was commandeered for the defense of the realm. Sir Walter Raleigh, the patron of the Roanoke colony, was busy organizing coastal defenses. When White begged for ships to take supplies back to America, he was told bluntly, "Not now. England comes first." The Queen issued a decree. No ships were allowed to leave English ports without permission. The lifeline to Roanoke was severed. For John White, it was a living nightmare. He was trapped in England while his family and 115 others were stranded on a hostile continent thousands of miles away. He spent the winter of 1587 and the spring of 1588 pacing the docks, begging, pleading, and pulling every string he had. Finally, in April 1588, Sir Walter Raleigh managed to secure 2 small, fast ships, pinnaces, for White. They were loaded with supplies and a few new settlers. White felt a surge of hope. They set sail. But the curse of Roanoke struck again. The captains of these 2 small ships were not interested in a humanitarian relief mission. They were privateers at heart. As soon as they hit the open ocean, they went hunting for Spanish prize ships. Instead of sailing straight for America, they attacked enemies much larger than themselves. It was a disaster. The ships were shot to pieces, their supplies were looted, and many of the crew were wounded. They limped back to England in May, defeated and empty-handed. White was devastated. The door to America slammed shut again. Then came the summer of 1588, and the Spanish Armada arrived. The great naval battles took place in the English Channel. Against all odds, England won. The Spanish fleet was destroyed by English fireships and terrible storms. England was saved, but the war dragged on. For 2 more agonizing years, 1589 and early 1590, White could not find a ship willing to cross the Atlantic. He sat in England, imagining the worst. Were they starving? Had the tribes attacked? Had the Spanish found them? Finally, in the spring of 1590, an opportunity arose. A wealthy merchant named John Watts was sending a fleet of privateering ships to the Caribbean to raid the Spanish. Sir Walter Raleigh convinced John Watts to let John White tag along on the flagship, the Hopewell. The agreement was that after they were done raiding in the Caribbean, they would make a quick stop at Roanoke on the way home to drop off White and some supplies. It wasn't a relief mission, it was an afterthought. But it was White's only chance. He took it. The journey in 1590 was long and frustrating for White. The privateers spent months in the Caribbean attacking Spanish settlements and chasing treasure ships, while White stewed in impatience. Every day wasted was another day his colony might be dying. By August 1590, hurricane season was approaching. The captains were anxious to get home to England with their loot. They almost decided to skip Roanoke entirely, but White's desperate pleas convinced them to stick to the agreement. As the Hopewell approached the outer banks of North Carolina, the weather turned nasty. A storm blew them around, and they nearly crashed onto the treacherous shoals that guard the coast. On August 17th, they spotted smoke rising from Roanoke Island in the distance. White's heart leapt. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. He thought, they are alive. They fired a cannon to signal their approach, expecting to see an answering signal fire. But none came. The next day, they tried to land. It was a disaster. The sea was violent. One of the small boats capsized in the surf. The captain of the Hopewell and 6 other sailors drowned right in front of White's eyes. The crew were furious and terrified. They wanted to abandon the mission right then.
White had to beg them to make one more attempt. As twilight fell on August 18, 1590, exactly 3 years to the day of Virginia Dare's birth, John White finally stepped back onto the shores of Roanoke Island. It was dark. The smoke they had seen earlier had vanished. To let the colonists know they had arrived, White and his men sounded trumpets. The brass notes echoed strangely over the water and the dark forests. Then they sang. They sang familiar English folk songs, tunes that would be instantly recognizable to the settlers. They sang into the darkness, waiting for a shout, a call, a welcoming cry in return. Silence. Only the chirping of crickets and the wash of the waves answered them. The haunting melody faded into the oppressive quiet of the American wilderness. A deep sense of dread settled into John White's bones. They returned to the ship to wait for dawn.
At daybreak on August 19, White and a heavily armed party rowed back ashore. They moved inland toward the site of the settlement. As they climbed a sandy bank near the shore, they found their first clue. On a large tree, stripped of its bark, 3 letters were carved deeply into the wood. C-R-O. White stared at it. He remembered the protocol. If they left, they were to carve their destination. Crow must mean Croatoan, the island to the south where the friendly tribe in Monteo lived. Crucially, there was no crossmark above the letters. This meant they had not left in immediate distress or panic. Hope flickered again. Perhaps they had simply moved to a better location with friendly neighbors. The group pushed on through the woods until they reached the clearing where the city of Raleigh had stood 3 years ago. John White stopped in his tracks. The cottages he had left behind were gone. They hadn't been burned down in an attack, they had been carefully dismantled. The wood and supplies had been taken away. Where the houses once stood, there was now a large, sturdy palisade, a fort wall made of tall wooden stakes driven into the ground. It was built for defense. White approached the entrance of the fort. The main gate post had been stripped of bark, just like the tree near the shore. Carved into the post, in large capital letters, was a single word: Croatoan. White ran his hands over the carvings. He looked frantically above the word, below it, and around the post. There was no cross. White stood inside the empty fort. The ground was overgrown with weeds and melons. They found heavy iron bars and cannon shot that the settlers had buried before leaving, likely because they were too heavy to carry to their new location. They found 5 old chests that had been dug up and ransacked by natives sometime in the last 3 years. White recognized 3 of them as his own. His books, his maps, his watercolor paintings were ruined by rain and scattered in the dirt. But of the 117 people, of Eleanor, of little Virginia Dare, there was not a trace. No bones, no graves, no signs of a massacre. It was as if they had simply dissolved into the mist. White clung to the hope the carvings gave him. They must be at Croatoan, he reasoned. It made sense. Monteo was there. The tribe was friendly. It was a better location for fishing. They had left peacefully, taken their houses apart, and moved south. He returned to the ship relieved. He convinced the captain, Captain Spicer, to sail south to Croatoan Island the next morning to find them. But the curse of Roanoke was not finished with John White. That night, a massive hurricane hit the coast. The ships were battered, cables snapped, anchors were lost. They were nearly blown out to sea. By the next morning, the ships were heavily damaged and leaking. The crew was near mutiny. They had no fresh water, and the weather was worsening. Captain Spicer made a cold calculation. If they tried to sail south to Croatoan, they would likely wreck the ships and all die. "We cannot go to Croatoan," the captain told White. "We must return to England now, or we will never return at all." John White begged. He pleaded. He was so close, only 50 miles away from where he believed his family was waiting.
But the captain was firm. They turned the ships east, away from America, and set sail for England. John White stood at the stern of the Hopewell, watching the coast of North Carolina disappear for the final time. He had found the clue, but he lost the chance to follow it. He would never return to the New World. He would die in lonely exile in Ireland years later, never knowing the fate of his daughter and granddaughter. He left behind a mystery that would haunt a nation for centuries. What happened after they carved that word? Where did they go?
When John White's sails disappeared over the horizon in August 1590, a door closed on American history. The Atlantic Ocean became a vast, impassable barrier of silence. For nearly 20 years, no English ship returned to those haunted shores to look for the 117 lost souls. The Spanish War dragged on, distracted England. Sir Walter Raleigh, the mastermind behind the colony, fell out of favor with the Queen and was eventually imprisoned in the Tower of London. The dream of Roanoke withered on the vine. It wasn't until 1607, when the English established Jamestown, their first permanent successful colony further north in Virginia, that serious questions began to be asked again. What happened to those who came before? The Jamestown settlers were desperate for information. They heard rumors whispered among the local Native American tribes. There were stories of people with gray eyes living in the interior. Tales of a tribe that lived in stone houses and knew how to tame wild turkeys. Reports of natives who used English tools. Captain John Smith, the famous leader of Jamestown, interviewed Chief Powhatan, the powerful ruler of the tribes in that region. Powhatan chilled Smith to the bone with a confession. He claimed that a group of the Roanoke colonists had survived for years, living peacefully with the tribe called the Chesapeaceans. But shortly before Jamestown was founded, Powhatan's priests warned him that a nation would rise from that area to destroy him. In a preemptive strike, Powhatan claimed he slaughtered the Chesapeaceans and the white settlers living with them. To prove it, he showed Smith several English-made iron tools and a musket barrel. Was this the end of Virginia Dare? Slaughtered and a political maneuver by a powerful chief? Or was Powhatan lying to intimidate the new English arrivals? In the 4 centuries since, historians, archaeologists, and storytellers have agonized over the clues, spinning theories ranging from the plausible to the fantastical. What really happened when they carved Croatoan? The assimilation theory, the most likely path. This theory suggests they did exactly what they said they would. They were starving and terrified. The Croatoan tribe on Hatteras Island was friendly, and Manteo was one of them. The settlers likely dismantled their houses, took their supplies, and moved south to live with the Croatoans. Over time, as no rescue ships came, they intermarried and assimilated into the tribe. They didn't die, they just stopped being English. They became Native Americans. This explains why there was no distress cross. It was a planned, peaceful move for survival. The massacre theory. As Chief Powhatan claimed, they might have been killed. Perhaps they tried to move inland and were attacked by hostile tribes. Or perhaps the Spanish, patrolling the coast, discovered the settlement and wiped it out to protect their claim on the New World. However, Spanish archives contain no records of finding or attacking Roanoke. The lost at sea theory. Some believe the colonists grew desperate. They might have used the wood from their dismantled houses to build a small ship and attempted to sail back to England, only to be swallowed by the merciless Atlantic, vanishing without a trace. The Site X theory. Recent analysis of one of John White's old watercolor maps revealed a hidden clue.
under a patch on the map, invisible to the naked eye, but revealed by modern imaging technology, was a symbol for a fort located inland, 50 miles west of Roanoke along the Chowan River. Historians call this Site X. Was this their secret backup plan? Did they split up, some going to Croatoan Island to wait for ships, others going inland to try and farm at Site X? For centuries, Roanoke was just a story. But in the last few decades, modern science has begun to unearth its truth. Archaeologists have turned their attention away from Roanoke Island itself, which has yielded very few clues due to erosion and centuries of searching, and focused on Hatteras Island, formerly Croatoan, and the inland Site X. What they have found is tantalizing. On Hatteras Island, near an ancient Native American village site, archaeologists have discovered items that should not be there. Buried in soil layers dating to the late 16th century, mixed in with native pottery and arrowheads, were purely European items. A gentleman's gold signet ring, featuring a lion crest, likely worn by one of the wealthier leaders of the 1587 colony. A small copper slate with an English M etched into it. Pieces of lead shot used in English muskets. Copper tubing used for drawing straight lines on maps. These were not trade goods. These were personal possessions of Elizabethan English people, found exactly where the carving said they would go. It is the strongest physical evidence yet that at least some of the colonists survived and integrated with the Croatoan tribe. Meanwhile, at Site X inland, archaeologists have found huge amounts of unique Elizabethan pottery, far more than would be expected from simple trade. They found metal hooks used to stretch tents, suggesting a long-term English presence there after 1587. The evidence suggests a complex truth. The colony likely split up. The main group probably went to Croatoan Island to live with Manteo, waiting for ships that never came. Another smaller group might have headed inland to try and establish a farm at Site X. They didn't disappear into thin air. They vanished into the American landscape. We will never know the full, definitive story of the lost colony. There will never be a diary found that explains the final days of Ananias and Eleanor Dare. We will never know what language little Virginia Dare spoke when she grew up, English, an Algonquian dialect, or a mixture of both. But the mystery of Roanoke is more powerful than any answer could be. It is America's origin myth. It is a haunting reminder of how precarious life was on the edge of an unknown continent. It is a story about the terrifying vastness of the wilderness, where an entire civilization could simply be swallowed whole, leaving behind only a single word whispered by the wind. Today, if you visit the Fort Raleigh National Historic Site on Roanoke Island, you can walk under the dark, towering pines. You can stand near the reconstructed earthworks of the old fort. The air feels heavy there, thick with history and unanswered questions. You can look out over the Sound toward Hatteras Island and wonder. The 117 men, women, and children did not disappear. They became the sand, the trees, and the bloodline of a new nation. They were the first seeds planted in the difficult soil of America, seeds that had to die in their original form, so that something new could grow. They are gone, but the word remains, carved not just into wood, but into the American psyche. Croatoan.